Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is part of my book report series where I will be talking about a book that I recently read that I really enjoyed and wanted to share with others. This is My Friends by Hisham Matar. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But before I get into the book, I wanted to make a plug for another book. Well, I'm writing a book. In the process of writing it. This is related to an expansion of an article I wrote back in 2021 for a wellness publication called Well and Good. And the article was about the wellness industry and the pandemic and prison abolition and what those things have to do with each other. And basically my argument about how the pandemic provided some insight into why wellness, it should be treated as a right, and that if we took care of everyone, we wouldn't need prisons, and that bringing more examples from the universal experience of the pandemic to talk about the fundamental idea that hurt people, and therefore the opposite is also true, right? That healed people are far less likely to hurt other people. Anyway, I'm mentioning all of that because it's a nonfiction book. One of the things that I've been told is that in order to find an agent and to get published, it's really important to have a strong author platform, and that means presence on social media, articles written, things like that. And my podcast is part of that. And so if you are a listener, if you are able to leave a review or a rating or both, share the podcast with others so that more people find the podcast and can enjoy it, that would really help me in helping to boost my platform to support my book writing project, which I hope to share more about in future episodes. So just a thank you, an ask and a thank you to listeners about that. So back to the book report, not my book, but the book for today, My Friends by Hisham Matar. The title is called My Friends, and I actually bought this with a friend that I was visiting in Geneva. And it's a lovely book, and I bought it last year, and I didn't buy it with any thinking of its potential relevancy to the current moment. But man, is it on point and helping me reflect and process the current moment. And I think a lot of us are, particularly if you're living in the United States, are in that headspace. And so I thought it would be particularly pertinent to talk about this book. And I hope that not only, obviously, I do the book reports because I think that these are books that other people will enjoy reading, but I hope that it can also bring some perspective and some comfort during what is a really chaotic and tumultuous and uncertain time. So My Friends it's fictional, but it's historical fiction, which so many of my recommendations are because it's my favorite genre. It's historical fiction set predominantly in London, but the main characters are from Libya. They're Libyans who have gone to live in the UK. And this is during the time of the Gaddafi dictatorship, which was a multi-decade dictatorship. And it tells the story of living in exile. It tells the story of friends and family and what it is like to navigate being from a place that is under dictatorial rule, and what does home mean, and what does it mean to be able to leave home voluntarily versus be forced to leave or not being able to return. The main character and a friend of his end up taking part in a protest against the dictatorship in London. And as a result of that, they feel that they are unable to return home because they are afraid of the, potential repercussions by the dictatorship, right? That they might be imprisoned or tortured, or that their family members might be harmed because they dared to speak out against the regime. And there's so many passages in this book that I would want to read, that as I was reading them, I was thinking about how they are applicable to any situation where you have an authoritarian regime. And the reality is that, for human history, that has been the norm, right? Peace is actually the exception, at least in, I don't know, the last however many hundreds of years, if not thousands, where there are very similar patterns to how authoritarian and dictatorial regimes play out, and then the consequences that there are for people in navigating that. The current times have made me think about the fact that my Brazilian side of the family, they lived through the Brazilian military dictatorship, which was from 1964 to 1984. And there are many, many other countries in modern history who have lived through such periods. And I hope to talk about my family's experience more in another episode. But yeah, My Friends by Hisham Matar talks about what it's like for this particular group of individuals to navigate this time of what's happening in Libya, what's happening for those who remain, for those who leave, those who are forced to leave, those who cannot return, and then those that then did return after 2011 and the Arab Spring, and Gaddafi died, and there was a new day in Libya, and oh gosh, there's so many things. I wish I could sit down with you and show you these entries, but I'll just go through and read some of them about that really resonated with me in terms of what seemed to be reflections from the book seemed to really resonate with the current moment. And one of them, so the main character, his father plays a large role in this book. And his father took the perspective, right? There's many ways to deal with an authoritarian regime. There's many ways to survive that insanity. And the main character's father, the main character, his name is Khalid, so I'll refer to him. Khalid's father, he had been an intellectual. I mean, he was an intellectual. He had a PhD from Cairo University, and he was in a position to become quite a prominent intellectual in Libya. But then Gaddafi took over, and Gaddafi assumed power in Libya in 1969. AndLl just read this passage about how his father decided to, respond to this change in circumstances, and then some advice that he gave as a result of that. So this is from page 26. After 1969, the year Gaddafi assumed power, my father quietly turned down academic posts and lucrative positions on state-sponsored committees and disappeared into a job that suited neither his talents nor his ambition. He became a general history teacher in a middling school in a low-income neighborhood of Benghazi. Eventually, he was promoted to headmaster. he accepted only because refusing would have raised suspicion. And then it goes on. But it talks about, right, like it's one of the things that we know that is one of the ways of adapting to these circumstances, of trying to still live life in a meaningful way, but a way that would make you less likely to be a target. I heard today that there was, I don't know his name, but there's some New York Times reporter who covers LGBTQ issues who resigned today at the time I'm recording this. And I didn't look into this. This is something someone else told me. So, take that for what that's worth. But the person who told me this, their theory, as to why this person resigned from obviously a very lucrative position if they're a New York Times columnist and have a massive platform, is given the nature of what they write about, they have made a decision to make themselves less of a target when we have an administration that is literally trying to erase trans people, right, from the law, from public existence, and is doing so quickly and with a massive hatred. And so Khaled's father took that approach, that he continued to be a scholar, but as the book says, he conducted his research in the dark, in his spare time, never publishing a word of it. This policy turned his vocation into a hobby and a refuge. And it's one approach, right, of how to survive this time. And it relates to this piece of advice that that the father gives, or there's like a couple of references to how Khaled views his father and how his father sees himself that really spoke to the present moment here in my view. So this is on page 141, where Khaled's talking about his father, and he's describing how much he loves his father, and how he describes him as this. He describes his father as the talented historian who managed to remain independent, part of that silent army that exists in every country, made up of individuals who had come to the conclusion that they live among unreasonable compatriots, and therefore must, like grown-ups in a playground, endure the chaos until the bell rings, resigned to the fact that this may come long after they are gone. And I love that, because again, there are those who remain independent, part of that silent army that exists in every country, made up of individuals who had come to the conclusion that they live among unreasonable compatriots and therefore must, like grown-ups in a playground, endure the chaos until the bell rings, resigned to the fact that this may come long after they are gone. And understanding, like we are living among unreasonable compatriots. And there are those who will fight directly. And there are those who will just get through and not engage because they know that what they're engaging with is unreasonable. And I'm not passing judgment on either. We need all of the above, right? And people take different roles. There are many different ways to engage, to resist, to survive. And this book does a beautiful job of detailing how are the various ways, right, that people cope in this type of environment. And okay, I'm like jumping around, but right, is in that framing of his father, he talks about a question Khaled's father always tells him, that in giving him some advice about life, that the question Arguably the most important question of all is how to escape the demands of unreasonable men. Again, the question, arguably the most important question of all, is how to escape the demands of unreasonable men. And I remember reading that and being like, gosh, like that's exactly what we're living through. We are living at a time where we are governed by unreasonable men. And how do we escape their demands? That is the question. How do we live our lives in such a way that we can escape their demands, the demands of unreasonable men, such that hopefully we can be here at the end of it, that we can survive this time? And that really, really struck me as well. And in the novel as well, it talks about a short story that circulated in the 1980s that was a story in resistance to the regime. And it got the author of the story, who lived in exile already as a way of protecting himself. It got him in a lot of trouble. And the story is basically, I don't want to read it out because you can read the details and I can't do it justice. This short story that is within this novel that is allegorical about resisting oppression and a dictatorial regime. And the story talks about that resistance, but also how you can be so blindsided by it. And I want to read a passage from the book that is a reflection of the author about this short story that, again, was circulating in the 1980s among Libyans, and how it, for the author, it set off a series of events in his life, but just seems so, again, it feels so on point for the current moment. So in this story, there is a man, and he basically lets things happen for a long time. And then at the end of the story, he says no. And that ends the bad things. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's essentially it. And the Khalid, the main character of this story, reflects on it and says, I was unable to ignore the story's claustrophobic atmosphere, manifested so horribly in the man's inexplicable lack of objection, which is rendered all the more upsetting by how effective his protest proves to be when it eventually comes. Manifested so horribly in the man's inexplicable lack of objection, which is rendered all the more upsetting by how effective his protest proves to be when it eventually comes. And gosh, that really, really struck me, right? How horrific it is to see the lack of objection happening as to what is going on in the United States. I understand that there are people objecting and that there is pushback. But by and large, we know, right, that the mainstream media has been captured by billionaire interests. Republicans have absolutely no interest in fighting back. Democrats are doing a little bit, I guess, now that they're getting pushback from their constituents, but my God, are not doing enough. And there's just, and so much is happening so fast. And, the Supreme Court is captured as well, that it seems that there is an unwillingness, to admit how bad things are, right? How horrible is this inexplicable lack of objection, which is rendered all the more upsetting by how effective his protest proves to be when it eventually comes. The lack of objection that we are seeing is all the more upsetting because, like protest does work. And I don't mean just like protesting in the streets, though that is very important. And that is always something that dictatorial regimes crack down on. But if there was coordinated opposition to this stuff, like so much of this we have literally just been sleepwalking into. None of this stuff had to happen this way. There could have been opposition to all of, I'm not even going back to the election, right? There's so much that could have been done to prevent Trump from becoming president again. And at the same time, right, I did a whole episode about how like his coming to power again makes so much sense in the arc of American history. But even since he has like taken off, like there's just so many things that Democrats, because Republicans are not going to do anything, they don't care about democracy, could have done and could be doing. And the complicity of the mainstream media in like not calling a coup for what it is, not calling Nazi gestures, and the like. It is maddening, because if we were to stand up collectively, like, it's actually effective. And we know it's effective because the certain things that there already have been significant pushback on, they've already backed down on, to some degree, including the tariffs, including like freezing all federal funding, right? Because it affects too many people. Anyway, just that line of so horribly in the man's inexplicable lack of objection, which is rendered all the more upsetting by how effective his protest proves to be when it eventually comes. We are not powerless, but every dictatorial regime will make you think that you are. We actually do have power. And how we choose to wield that power, as this novel explores, right, is a personal choice. And there's many ways that people get through these times. Khalid's father takes one approach. Khalid himself takes another approach. Some of his friends take another. Yeah. And then this passage goes on to talk about, some of the other feelings that come up in this type of time, in this type of environment, right? That the savage sense of my own helplessness. I became in silent and private ways powerfully aware of the fragility of all that I treasured, my family, my very sense of myself, the future I allowed myself to expect. And so I was just saying, like, we have power, which we absolutely do, and at the same time recognizing that, like, that sense of helplessness and the fragility of the future that we believed that we could have, we've allowed ourselves to expect. I think we had with the pandemic, right, a reckoning with that, of believing that life would be a certain way, and then that being turned on a dime, and we are living life in quite a different way, right? And how to deal with that. And we are living through another moment of that, right? We are living through another moment of that. And I think that I don't mean all of this to say to inspire despair, not at all. I think this is just, it's all bad. Like, it's very bad. I don't want to minimize that. And yet, this has happened so many times in human history, and people make it through. People have always made it through. Not everyone does, but people make it through. And this novel, My Friends, tells the story, of one group of people making it through and how they made it through. And one of the things that allows them to make it through is friendship and the importance of friendship. And Khalid's father also gives him advice about friends, and, Khalid asks him, like, well, how can you tell, if someone's your friend? And his father says, simple. Do they give you pleasure, and do you trust them? And I see that as like, right, like, are they a net positive in your life, right? Do they bring you joy? And are there people that you can rely on, right? And again, like I said, I bought this with a friend, and then reading this novel about the power of friendship in good times and bad, and how people can anchor us, friends can anchor us when we are apart from our families, even when our families are near. Our friends are our chosen family, right? As people say. And I've been reflecting on that a lot as we entered this period of dictatorship in the United States. Certainly an oligarchy, an authoritarian regime, where the government is currently being run by someone who was unelected, who is doing whatever he wants. And so many entities and people have decided to comply in advance, as often happens, right? Authoritarians actually, as it says, right, like, protest is actually quite powerful when it eventually comes. Like, there's so much fragility to the actual people in power, but it requires the people to face them and to feel supported in doing so. And certainly the powers that be and the mainstream media and everything has not given people confidence to do that. They have all, again, complied in advance, including by things like, right, like not pulling endorsements for Kamala Harris for the election, paying off Trump, essentially. CNN has done that, Meta has done that, and others. Anyway, but just, thinking about my friends and the anchoring that they provide me at all times in life, but they will be particularly important in these coming times. And I think the title of this novel, My Friends, it could be so many things, right? Because it's a story about exile, and it's a story about political instability, and it's a story about family and love and all these things. And to call it My Friends is obviously a deliberate choice to talk about that, the role of those relationships in surviving chaotic times. So anyway, I highly recommend My Friends. And I won't read the whole jacket cover, but the last sentence of the jacket cover says, My Friends is an intensely moving novel about three friends living in political exile and the emotional homeland that friendship can provide, from one of Britain's greatest living authors. Yeah, the emotional homeland that friendship can provide. I can very much relate to that. And in these times, what is home? What is our home? What is our homeland? Gets very much challenged as people are deported, as people are exiled, as people choose to leave, as people are forced to leave, as people are displaced, as people are disappeared, as people are killed, as people die, as people move. Where is our emotional homeland? And who are those people? And how can we invest in them and those connections to get us through? Because the only way through is through. So that is our task. And I have found My Friends by Hisham Matar comforting as we are in the early days of what is to come. And I hope that it might be comforting to you too. And I realize that, quoting stuff from the middle of the book might not so translate so well and just listening to it by audio. But I hope that you'll get a copy or, get the audiobook, and it'll make more sense. And once you've read the book, then you can come back and let me know and be like, okay, everything that you said now makes sense. But yeah, it's really powerful when a novel can really hit the moment, even though it's not about this moment. But it was published last year, and even though it's about a different historical setting, the parallels to the current moment are profound. So, all right, that's enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. Let me know if you do end up reading, my friends. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.